Ever wonder what a war is really made of? And it's not just bullets and bombs. It's not just grand strategies drawn on maps in quiet, safe rooms far from the fighting. A war is made of mud. It's made of hunger, fear, and waiting. And more than anything, it's made of problems. A bootlace breaks. A can of food won't open. A 30-ton tank is stopped dead by a wall of dirt and roots. When the standard issue gear fails, when the rulebook is useless, what happens? Human ingenuity happens. The WWII, more than any conflict before it, became a global laboratory for improvisation. It was a 6-year contest of desperation and cleverness, fought not just by engineers in factories, but by muddy, exhausted soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had to invent their way out of a crisis or die. They used scrap metal, salvaged wire, empty shell casings, and anything they could get their hands on to create solutions. These weren't polished, patented products. They were rough, ugly, and brilliant. They were born from necessity. How does a simple can opener become a symbol of an army's resilience? How do you turn an airplane's machine gun into a handheld weapon of terrifying power? What does a soldier do when his tank is blind, his food is cold, and the enemy has a new trick he's never seen before? He gets to work, he tinkers, he builds, he survives. Number 21. How do you turn a 30-ton tank into a hedge trimmer? The problem was the landscape itself. In the summer of 1944, Allied forces found themselves in Normandy, a part of France that looked nothing like the open fields they had trained for. They were in the Bocage country. This wasn't just countryside, it was a fortress built by nature and ancient farmers. For centuries, farmers had cleared stones from their fields and piled them at the edges. Over generations, dirt, shrubs, and massive trees grew into these mounds, creating a landscape of small fields separated by immense earthen walls. These were hedgerows. They were 5, 10, sometimes 15 feet high, and packed with thick, tangled roots. For an advancing army, they were a nightmare. Infantrymen trying to climb over them were exposed to machine gun fire. Or tanks tried to drive over them, but their tracks would spin, and the tank would rear up, exposing its thin belly armor to enemy anti-tank guns. It was a meat grinder. The Allied breakout from the Normandy beaches was stalling, the advance was measured in yards, not miles, and the cost in lives was horrific. The High Command was desperate for a solution. They tried using engineers with explosives, but this was slow, loud, and signaled their every move. They tried using tank dozers, but there weren't enough of them. The war was in danger of getting bogged down in an agonizing, bloody stalemate. The solution came not from a general or a high-level engineer, but from a sergeant. His name was Curtis G. Coolin, a 29-year-old from New York who had been a taxi driver before the war. He was with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Like everyone else, he saw the problem firsthand. He saw the tanks getting stuck, he saw the men dying. The story goes that he was talking to a fellow soldier who remarked that it was a shame they couldn't just invent something to cut through the hedgerows. That simple thought sparked an idea in Coulin's mind. He had seen the massive steel obstacles the German forces had placed on the beaches to stop landing craft. They were made from thick, welded railroad tracks and I-beams. Coulin wondered, what if you could take that steel, fashion it into giant teeth, and weld it to the front of a tank? The tank's own weight and power could then be used not to climb over the hedgerow, but to rip right through it. He built a prototype. He took steel scraps from a German roadblock, and with the help of his unit's welders, fashioned a tusk-like device. They attached it to the front of a light M5 Stuart tank. The initial tests were promising. The device, which looked like a monstrous metal rake, allowed the tank to plow through the base of a hedgerow, tearing up the earth and roots. It created a hole big enough for the tank and other vehicles to pass through. The invention was demonstrated to high-ranking officers. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, came to see it for himself. He was skeptical, as commanders often are, of strange, unofficial contraptions, but he watched as a Sherman tank, fitted with Coulin's device, charged a hedgerow. Instead of climbing and exposing its belly, it disappeared into the wall of green. A moment later, it burst through the other side, guns blazing. Bradley was instantly convinced. He reportedly turned to his staff and ordered, "Get every ordnance and engineer outfit in the army over here. I want them to see this. Then I want this thing put on every tank we've got." The device was nicknamed the Rhino for its powerful charging appearance. It was also called the Coulin Hedgerow Cutter. An enormous round-the-clock production effort began. Welding teams worked day and night, using steel scavenged from the German beach obstacles. The design was simple enough that it could be replicated quickly in field workshops. By the time the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the major breakout offensive from Normandy, on July 25, 1944, an estimated 60% of the U.S. Sherman tanks had been equipped with the Rhino device. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Tanks that were once trapped could now lead the charge. They punched holes in the hedgerow defenses, allowing infantry and other vehicles to pour through. The German defenders, who had relied on the bocage as a near-perfect defensive terrain, were caught by surprise. The stalemate was broken. Sergeant Coulin's simple, brilliant idea, born from battlefield observation and built with enemy scrap, helped change the course of the battle for France. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention. What don't we know about the Rhino tank's full story? How many other soldiers had similar ideas that were never heard by the right person? Were there units that created their own different versions of a hedgerow cutter that have been lost to history? And how did the German soldiers on the front lines first react when they saw a 30-ton tank suddenly rip a hole through a barrier they believed was impenetrable? Number 20, how do you give a soldier more firepower than a whole squad? In the brutal close quarters fighting of the Pacific Islands, U.S. Marines faced an enemy who was dug in, fanatical, and expert in camouflage. Battles for places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima were not fought across open fields. They were fought in dense jungles, volcanic caves, and fortified bunkers. The standard issue weapons were often not enough. The M1 Garand was a superb rifle, but it fired one shot at a time. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, provided squad-level automatic fire, but it was heavy and had a small 20-round magazine. What the Marines desperately needed was a weapon that could lay down a massive, sustained volume of fire, something to suppress enemy positions and cut through the thick jungle foliage. They needed a portable machine gun, but a true heavy machine gun was a crew-served weapon, far too cumbersome for a single man to carry and operate effectively in an assault. The solution was found not on the ground, but in the air. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps used Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers. These aircraft were armed with .30 caliber and .50 caliber Browning machine guns. These were magnificent weapons designed to be lightweight, air-cooled, and capable of a very high rate of fire, much higher than their ground-based counterparts. A ground-based M1919 .30 caliber machine gun fired around 500 rounds per minute. The aircraft version, the AN-M2, could fire over 1,200 rounds per minute. In the rear of a dive bomber, this gun was mounted on a flexible ring for the gunner to defend the plane. Sometime in 1943, on the island of Vella La Vella in the Solomons, a group of resourceful Marines from Marine Air Group 11 had a radical idea. What if they could take that aircraft gun and turn it into a one-man infantry weapon? The project was led by Marine Corporal Tony Stein. He and his fellow mechanics took an AN-M2 .30 caliber machine gun from a wrecked Dauntless bomber. The first problem was figuring out how a person could hold and fire it. The gun had no stock, no pistol grip, and no traditional trigger. It was meant to be bolted into a plane. They began to experiment. They took the stock from a BAR and somehow managed to attach it to the rear of the machine gun's receiver. For a trigger mechanism, they had to improvise a new system, rigging a simple grip and trigger that could operate the gun's firing sear. They needed a bipod to help control the weapon's furious recoil, so they attached one near the muzzle. The result was a strange Frankenstein's monster of a gun. It was cobbled together from aircraft and infantry parts. It was ugly. They nicknamed it the Stinger. The Stinger was a beast. It weighed about 25 pounds, lighter than a full-size machine gun, but it spat out bullets at more than twice the rate. The sheer volume of fire was shocking. It could chew through log bunkers and slice through jungle undergrowth in seconds. The weapon was a secret, an unofficial field modification, but its effectiveness was undeniable. When the 5th Marine Division was preparing for the invasion of Iwo Jima in early 1945, Tony Stein, now a corporal in the 28th Marines, managed to get one of the 6 Stingers ever made. On February 19, 1945, the first day of the Iwo Jima landing, Stein used his Stinger to devastating effect. Landing, with the first wave on the black sand beaches, he single-handedly suppressed multiple enemy pillboxes that were pinning down his company. He would fire a full belt of ammunition, sprint back to the beach under fire to rearm, and then charge forward again. He made 8 trips, continuously providing covering fire for his fellow Marines. His actions that day earned him the Medal of Honor. His citation specifically mentions him using his personally devised weapon. Like the Stinger was too powerful, like in some ways. Its incredible rate of fire meant it could empty its 100-round ammunition belt in just a few seconds. The barrel would overheat quickly, and the recoil was brutal. It was a weapon for a strong, brave, and slightly crazy man. Only a handful were ever made, each a custom job. The Stinger was never officially adopted. It remained a legend, a testament to the ingenuity of Marines who saw a problem and built a solution out of the wreckage around them. It represents the ultimate expression of a soldier's desire for more firepower. What questions remain about the Stinger's brief, violent life? Were there other custom-built machine guns like it, perhaps in other theaters of the war, whose stories were never told? How did the armorers actually solve the complex mechanical problem of adapting the aircraft gun's firing mechanism for a handheld trigger? And what happened to the other 5 Stingers after the war ended? Number 19, can a simple can opener define an army? It is perhaps the smallest and most overlooked piece of military equipment ever issued, yet it may be one of the most important. It weighed less than an ounce. It was a small, hinged piece of steel, barely an inch and a half long. It was the P-38 can opener. In a war fought with massive machines and explosive power, the story of the P-38 is a story about the individual soldier and his most basic need, food. Before WWII, American military field rations were often cumbersome and unappealing, but the war demanded a new kind of ration, one that was lightweight, durable, and could be carried by an individual soldier for days. The result was the C ration, which consisted of pre-cooked food in small metal cans. There was just one problem: how to open them. A soldier couldn't be expected to carry a full-sized kitchen can opener with him into a foxhole. He needed something small, light, and foolproof. The challenge was taken up in the summer of 1942 at the Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago. The design that emerged was a stroke of minimalist genius, officially designated the can opener US P-38. The origin of the name is a bit of a mystery. Some say it was named for the 38 punctures it took to open a C ration can. Others, more fancifully, suggest it opened a can as fast as a P-38 Lightning fighter plane. Whatever its origin, the design was perfect. A little stamped metal blade that folded into a handle, which also served as a lever. It was so small it could be worn on a dog tag chain around a soldier's neck. It was simple, with no complex parts to break. It just worked, every single time. The Army began issuing them by the millions, usually packed inside crates of C rations. The P-38 quickly became more than just a can opener. For the American GI, it was a multi-tool, a symbol of self-reliance in a world of chaos. Soldiers found countless other uses for it. It was a screwdriver for adjusting the sights on a rifle. It was a scraper for cleaning mud out of boots or equipment. It could be used to clean fingernails, gut a fish, or even perform an emergency field tracheotomy. Those stories of this are likely apocryphal. It was a universal tool for prying, scraping, and cutting. It became an essential part of a soldier's personal kit, as important as his rifle or his helmet. Like, it was something he owned, something that was always with him. In the dehumanizing environment of war, this tiny piece of personal gear was a connection to a simple solvable problem: opening a can of hash or beans. It was a small bit of control in a world that was utterly out of control. The story of the P-38 is not one of a single inventor, but of a design process that perfectly understood its user. The soldier who designed it, Major Thomas Dennehy, created something that was cheap to produce, easy to use, and incredibly durable. The affection soldiers had for this little tool is well documented. They called it the John Wayne, because he could do anything. When the C rations were eventually replaced by the meal, ready-to-eat MRE in the 1980s, which came in soft pouches, the P-38 was no longer officially issued. But the outcry was so great from soldiers who had come to rely on it that the Pentagon continued to make them available. Even today, older veterans will often pull a P-38 from their keychain, a small, worn piece of steel that is a memento of their service. It's a reminder that sometimes the most ingenious inventions are not the most complex, but the most simple. It was an invention that didn't win a battle, but it helped millions of soldiers fight one. What mysteries still surround this iconic piece of gear? Was the design inspired by a pre-existing civilian tool, or was it a completely original military invention? How many were actually produced during the war, and how many are still in existence today, tucked away in drawers and on keychains? And are the more extreme stories of its use, like in emergency surgery, based on any documented reality, or are they purely the stuff of military legend? Number 18, what do you do when the enemy lays a trap under every inch of sand? The war in North Africa was a war of movement of vast distances across a seemingly empty desert. But the desert was not empty. It was filled with mines. Both sides, Allied and Axis, used millions of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines to defend positions, channel enemy attacks, and protect their flanks. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a constant, nerve-wracking threat. A single misstep could mean death or a horrific injury. Clearing a minefield was one of the most dangerous jobs in the army. The standard method was for a sapper, an army engineer, to crawl forward on his belly, carefully probing the ground ahead of him with a bayonet or a thin rod. It was slow, terrifying work, done under the constant threat of sniper fire and artillery. A better, faster, and safer way had to be found. The problem was particularly acute for the British Eighth Army, fighting against the German Afrika Korps. They needed a way to clear paths through minefields quickly so that their tanks and infantry could advance. The idea of using a tank to somehow detonate the mines was an obvious one, but simply driving a tank over them would destroy the tank. The solution that emerged was one of the first of what would later be called Hobart's funnies. It was a tank modified to act as a mechanical minesweeper. The invention was a flail. The idea was to mount a large rotating drum on the front of a tank. Attached to the drum were dozens of heavy chains with steel balls, or flails, on the end. As the tank moved forward, the drum would spin rapidly, and the chains would beat the ground with incredible force, detonating any mines in its path. The first successful version of this was developed in the field in North Africa. A South African officer, Captain Abraham Dutoit, created a prototype which he called the Scorpion. It was based on the chassis of a Matilda tank. The flail was powered by a separate engine mounted on the side of the tank's hull, which was a clumsy but effective solution. The Scorpion was first used at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. In the dead of night, these strange roaring machines led the advance, their flailing chains creating a shower of sparks and explosions as they beat the earth. They cleared safe lanes through the massive German minefields known as the Devil's Gardens. They were not a perfect solution. They were mechanically complex and prone to breaking down. The dust and explosions they created made it difficult for the driver to see. But they worked. They proved that the concept was viable. The idea was taken back to Britain and refined by the brilliant but eccentric military engineer Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart was tasked with creating a whole range of specialized armored vehicles for the planned invasion of Europe. He perfected the flail tank, mounting the device on the more reliable Sherman tank. This version was called the Crab. The Crab's flail was powered by the tank's main engine, which was a much more elegant design. The drum spun at 140 revolutions per minute, and the chains could clear a path nearly 10 feet wide. The driver had to steer a precise, straight course, often under heavy fire, while the flailing chains made a deafening noise and threw dirt and debris everywhere. It was a terrifying job, but the Sherman Crab became one of the most important tools for the D-Day landings and the subsequent campaign in Europe. On June 6, 1944, they were among the first vehicles to come ashore, flailing paths through the mined beach defenses, allowing other tanks and vehicles to move inland. The flail tank was a brutal, mechanical solution to a deadly problem. It was an invention born from the specific challenges of the Desert War and perfected for the invasion of Europe. It saved countless lives by taking the most dangerous job in the army mine clearing and giving it to a machine. It showed how a tank could be transformed from a purely offensive weapon into a specialized engineering tool. It was loud, ugly, and violent, but for the soldiers who had to cross a minefield, the sight of a flail tank at work was a beautiful thing. What key details about the flail's development are still missing? Were there major failures or accidents during the testing of the early Scorpion prototypes in the desert that were never officially reported? How did the crews of these tanks develop the specific techniques needed to operate them effectively under fire, a skill that could only be learned through terrifying trial and error? And did the enemy ever devise a specific type of mine or trap designed to disable the flail mechanism itself? Number 17, how do you cook dinner in a war zone? For a soldier, war is long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. In those long, boring periods, the small comforts of life become incredibly important. A dry pair of socks, a letter from home, a hot meal. But getting a hot meal in a combat zone is a serious challenge. Large field kitchens are a prime target for enemy artillery. Building a fire creates smoke and light that can give away your position. During WWII, the standard American sea rations were designed to be eaten cold. They consisted of things like canned meat and vegetable hash, biscuits, and hard candy. Eaten cold, they were grim and monotonous, but if you could heat them up, they were transformed into a genuine morale-boosting meal. The problem was, how do you do that in a foxhole without getting yourself killed? The soldiers themselves, as they always do, found a way. The solution was the foxhole stove, a tiny improvised heater made from the most common materials available: a sea ration can and some dirt or sand. The process was simple. A soldier would take an empty sea ration can and punch a few holes around the bottom edge for air intake. He would then punch a larger hole or cut a flap near the top to create a flue for the exhaust. The can was then filled with sand or dirt, which was soaked with gasoline siphoned from a jeep or a truck. When lit, the gasoline-soaked sand would burn with a steady, low flame, much like the wick in a lamp. It produced very little smoke, and if shielded properly, almost no light. A soldier could place his can of food on top of this little stove and have a hot meal in a few minutes. This wasn't an official piece of equipment. There was no manual for it. It was a piece of soldier folklore, passed from veteran to new recruit. There were dozens of variations. Some soldiers used, a different type of can. Some experimented with different fuels like diesel or cleaning solvent, though gasoline was the most common. The foxhole stove was a perfect example of battlefield ingenuity. It took the trash of a previous meal empty can and turned it into the tool for making the next one. It was a closed-loop system of battlefield recycling. It addressed a fundamental human need and solved a real tactical problem. A warm meal on a cold, miserable night could make the difference between a soldier feeling like a human being and feeling like a hunted animal. The improvement to morale was immense. The foxhole stove had its dangers, of course. Gasoline is volatile. There were undoubtedly accidents, soldiers who burned themselves or set their gear on fire, but the risk was considered worth the reward. The stove was a small act of defiance against the misery of war. It was a way for a soldier to reclaim a tiny piece of civilization in the middle of chaos. The story of the foxhole stove is the story of every army in history. Soldiers have always found ways to make their lives a little more bearable. They have used their helmets to cook in, their bayonets to toast bread, and their ingenuity to overcome the shortcomings of their official equipment. The foxhole stove is just one of the most elegant and widespread examples of this phenomenon. It was a simple invention, but it fed the body and the soul. What do we not know about this humble invention? Who was the very first soldier to figure out this specific method, and in what theater of the war did it first appear? Were there master stove builders in certain units known for their superior designs? And how did military commanders officially view the practice, which involved the unauthorized use of government-issued fuel and carried a risk of fire and detection? Number 16, how does an army talk to itself in a storm of steel? The communication is the nervous system of an army. Without it, a unit is deaf and blind. A commander cannot give orders. A squad cannot call for help. An artillery battery cannot be told where to fire. In WWII, military communication relied heavily on two things: radios and field telephones. The radios were often heavy, unreliable, and their signals could be intercepted by the enemy. For secure, reliable communication between frontline positions, nothing beat the field telephone. This required a soldier, a telephone lineman, or wire dog to run a thin copper wire from one position to another, often under heavy fire. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the army. The wire was constantly being cut by shrapnel from artillery and mortar shells, or chewed up by the tracks of tanks. When the line went dead, someone had to go out, find the break, and splice it back together. In the heat of battle, especially during a defensive stand or a prolonged siege, the official supply of telephone wire could run out. Or the wire teams might be killed or pinned down, unable to do their job. But the need to communicate remained. This is where soldiers got creative. They used whatever they could find to create or repair communication lines. In the ruins of a bombed-out city like Stalingrad or Berlin, they would scavenge wire from civilian telephone poles, from destroyed buildings, even from the wiring harnesses of wrecked vehicles. Any two strands of conductive metal could, in a pinch, be turned into a field telephone line. They would use wire from farm fences in the countryside. In some documented cases, soldiers even used the metal wire from inside discarded tires. The process was rough and ready. The wire they found was often not insulated. They had to be careful to keep the two strands from touching each other, which would short out the circuit. They would use sticks to prop the wires up off the ground. They would use scraps of cloth, rubber, or even tree bark as makeshift insulators. They were creating a functioning electrical circuit in the middle of a battlefield using trash. These improvised lines were fragile and unreliable. A rainstorm could short them out, but they were better than nothing. They could carry the weak electrical current of a hand-cranked field telephone, allowing a forward observer to whisper coordinates to a mortar crew or a pinned-down squad leader to report his situation to his captain. This practice of using wild or scavenged wire was universal. It was done by American, British, German, and Soviet soldiers alike. The German army, known for its technical proficiency, even had official doctrine that encouraged the use of scavenged civilian telephone networks when possible. But the real ingenuity happened at the squad and platoon level. It was the individual soldier faced with a cut wire and an urgent need to talk who would crawl out of his foxhole and start looking for something, anything, to patch the line. This wasn't a glamorous invention, it wasn't a new weapon or a powerful vehicle. It was a quiet, desperate act of problem solving that happened 1,000 times a day on every front. It was the kind of improvisation that doesn't win medals, but that keeps an army from falling apart. It kept the nervous system of the army functioning even when it was being torn to shreds. What details about this common practice have been lost? How did soldiers without formal training as linemen learn the basic electrical principles needed to make these improvised lines work? Were there specific types of scavenged wire that were known to work better than others, creating a kind of battlefield folklore about the best sources? And are there any recorded instances where a crucial battle was won or lost, specifically because of the success or failure of a communication line made from scavenged parts? Number 15, what if your best weapon is just a piece of junk? In war is not always about advanced technology. Sometimes, it's about fooling the enemy into thinking you have advanced technology. Deception has always been a part of warfare, but in WWII it was raised to an art form. Both sides invested heavily in camouflage, codes, and misinformation. But some of the most effective deception was not created by intelligence agencies, but by regular soldiers in the field. The goal was simple: make the enemy think you are stronger than you are, or that you are in a place where you are not. One of the best ways to do this was with decoys. Soldiers became experts at building fake tanks, fake artillery guns, fake trucks, and even fake airplanes. The materials were whatever was on hand: wood, canvas, scrap metal, spare parts from wrecked vehicles. In the North African desert, where there was little to hide behind, British forces became masters of deception. They created a whole dummy army to fool the German and Italian forces. They built fake tanks out of wooden frames covered with canvas. From the air, especially from a fast-moving reconnaissance plane, these decoys were surprisingly convincing. They even built fake railway lines and water pipelines to suggest a major buildup in a certain area. They would use trucks to drive in circles in the desert, raising huge clouds of dust to simulate the movement of an armored column. They called this the Chinese Parliament, a flurry of activity that signified nothing. This wasn't just done on a grand scale. Individual units would create their own local deceptions. An artillery unit with only 4 guns might build a dozen fake guns out of logs and old wheels. They would place them in carefully constructed fake gun pits. To add to the realism, they would set off small explosive charges near the fake guns to simulate muzzle flashes and use smoke pots. The goal was to draw enemy counter battery fire to the fake positions, wasting their ammunition, and revealing the location of their own guns. A tank unit might create a dummy tank and park it in a prominent but seemingly concealed position. The hope was that an enemy anti-tank gunner would fire at the decoy, giving away his own hidden position, which could then be destroyed by the real tanks. The Soviets were also masters of this. Before the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, they engaged in a massive deception campaign known as Maskirovka military deception. They built thousands of dummy tanks and aircraft and concentrated them in fake assembly areas to mislead German intelligence about the true location and strength of their reserves. This was not just a top-down strategy. The soldiers on the ground were the ones who had to build these things. They had to have a keen eye for what looked real from a distance. They had to understand how a real tank crew would camouflage their vehicle and then replicate that on their wooden decoy. It was a strange kind of battlefield art where the goal was to create a convincing illusion of a deadly threat. These dummy vehicles and guns were an incredibly cost-effective weapon. For the price of a few pieces of wood and canvas, you could neutralize a piece of enemy artillery or an anti-tank gun. You could make the enemy waste precious reconnaissance flights. You could force the enemy commander to make a fatal miscalculation. Quite clever form of warfare that relied on psychology instead of explosives. It was an invention that didn't fire a shot but could be just as deadly as a real tank. What do we still not understand about the use of battlefield decoys? How effective were they really? Did reconnaissance pilots develop specific techniques to try and spot the fakes from the real thing? Were there any recorded instances of a soldier being decorated for his skill in building particularly convincing decoys? And did the soldiers who built them ever develop a strange artistic pride in their creations, even though they were just made of junk? Number 14, how do you protect a paratrooper from an enemy he can't even see? For the paratroopers of WWII, the most dangerous part of their job was not the fighting on the ground, but the few terrifying seconds of their descent. Floating down under a parachute, they were slow, helpless targets, but the enemy had devised threats that were even more insidious than ground fire. In the areas where they expected airborne landings, particularly in Normandy, German forces erected a defense known as Rommel's asparagus or Rommel's spargel. These were thick wooden poles, 10 to 15 feet high, driven into the ground in open fields and meadows. Many were topped with a mine or a sharpened point. For a glider, they were catastrophic. For a paratrooper, they were a deadly hazard. But there was another, even simpler threat wires. Like the enemy would string steel wires between trees or poles in likely drop zones. A paratrooper descending at night might not see the wire until it was too late. It could catch him under the chin or across the chest, causing a horrific, potentially fatal injury. The problem was clear. How do you protect the paratroopers and the crews of the C-47 transport planes from these unseen wires? The solution was simple, brutal, and invented by the men who flew the missions. They realized they needed a way to cut the wires before they could hit the airplane or the men jumping from it. They created what became known as Geronimo or Toreador cable cutters. These were not a standard issue item. They were fabricated in maintenance depots and airfields in England in the frantic weeks leading up to D-Day. The design was straightforward. They took thick hardened steel blades and mounted them on the leading edges of the C-47's wings and tailplane. The blades were angled forward, like the horns of a bull, designed to catch any wire the plane might fly into. The forward momentum of the aircraft would then force the wire down the blade to a sharpened, V-shaped notch, which would sever it. It was, in effect, a giant pair of wire cutters bolted to the front of the airplane. The idea was likely borrowed from similar, smaller devices used on British bombers to deal with barrage balloon cables. But the application for the low-flying C-47s was a unique and vital innovation. The work was done quickly with whatever materials were available. The welders and sheet metal workers in the service squadrons worked around the clock to equip the vast fleet of transport planes. On the night of June 5 to 6, 1944, as thousands of American and British paratroopers flew towards Normandy, these improvised cutters proved their worth. Many C-47 pilots reported hearing the loud whang of a wire striking their plane and being cut, a sound that would have meant disaster without the simple field-made devices. They were a purely defensive invention. They didn't kill any enemy soldiers or destroy any bunkers, but they saved the lives of countless aircrew and paratroopers. They allowed the transports to fly low and fast over the drop zones, minimizing their exposure to anti-aircraft fire and improving the accuracy of the jump. And it was an invention that addressed a very specific and very deadly problem with a beautifully simple mechanical solution. It was a testament to the forethought of the air service crews who anticipated a threat and engineered a way to defeat it. What remains unknown about this life-saving modification? Was there a single person or a specific unit that first developed the idea for applying cable cutters to C-47s, or did it emerge simultaneously in several places? How were the cutters tested to ensure they would actually work at flying speed without damaging the aircraft's wings? And are there any combat reports from pilots describing near misses or direct hits on these cutters that provide a clearer picture of just how many lives they might have saved on D-Day? Number 13, how do you make a tank less blind? A tank is a paradox. It is one of the most powerful and heavily armored vehicles on the battlefield, yet its crew can be terrifyingly vulnerable. The reason is vision. Inside a tank, especially with the hatches closed for protection, the crew's view of the outside world is extremely limited. They have to rely on narrow vision, slits, or periscopes. This creates a dangerous blind spot all around the tank, especially at close range. An enemy soldier with an anti-tank weapon could sneak up on a tank, unseen by the crew inside, and disable or destroy it. In the close quarters fighting in cities or dense forests, this was a constant and deadly threat. The tank commander was often the only one with a decent all-round view, but to get it, he had to stick his head out of the top hatch, exposing himself to sniper fire. The problem was how to give the crew, and especially the infantry supporting the tank, a way to communicate with each other. A soldier on the outside could see a threat that the tank crew couldn't, but how could he warn them? Shouting over the roar of the engine was often impossible, hand signals were easily missed. What they needed was a telephone, a simple way for an infantryman to plug in and talk directly to the tank commander. This wasn't a standard feature on most early and mid-war tanks, so the soldiers invented one. The field expedient tank infantry telephone was a simple but brilliant hack. Mechanics and signal corps technicians in field workshops would take a standard infantry field telephone, or just the handset and some wiring, and mount it inside a sturdy waterproof box. They would then weld this box to the outside of the tank, usually on the rear. A wire would be run from the box through an existing opening or a newly drilled hole into the tank's interior and connected to the crew's intercom system. On the outside, an infantryman could now simply walk up to the back of the tank, open the box, pick up the handset, and talk directly to the commander. He could say anti-tank gun in the window of the red building, second floor, providing the kind of precise real-time information that was impossible to convey otherwise. This simple modification dramatically improved the coordination between tanks and infantry, turning them from two separate elements into a true combined arms team. It helped to cover the tank's blind spots and protect it from close-range ambushes. It allowed the tank to use its powerful main gun with much greater precision, acting as a kind of mobile artillery piece for the foot soldiers. The idea was so effective that it was eventually adopted as a standard feature. Late war models of the M4 Sherman tank, for example, came from the factory with a built-in infantry telephone on the rear hull. But for much of the war, it was a soldier-made invention. The tank infantry phone is a perfect example of how a small, low-tech addition could solve a major tactical problem. You know, it wasn't a new weapon, but it made existing weapons far more effective. It was about communication and cooperation. It was a physical link between the soldier inside the steel box and the soldier on the ground outside, allowing them to work together to survive. It was an invention that grew directly from the bloody lessons of combat. What historical details about this innovation are still fuzzy? Which army or specific unit was the first to widely implement this kind of field modification? Are there documented battlefield accounts where an improvised tank telephone is specifically credited with saving a tank or winning a small unit engagement? And were there any significant technical challenges, such as waterproofing the external box or preventing the wiring from being damaged, that soldiers had to overcome through trial and error? Number 12. Can you turn a log into a lifesaver? The tank was the king of the WWII battlefield, but it had a secret weakness. Its armor was not equally strong all over. The thickest, most heavily sloped armor was on the front. The sides and rear were thinner, and the top and bottom were the thinnest of all. An experienced anti-tank gunner knew this. He would always try to get a shot at the side of a tank. Tank crews were acutely aware of this vulnerability. They lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that a single, well-placed enemy shell could tear through their thinner side armor and turn their vehicle into an inferno. The factories were producing tanks as fast as they could, and major design changes to increase armor were slow to implement. So the crews in the field took matters into their own hands. They began to add their own improvised armor to their tanks. This practice was seen on every front by every army in the war. The materials used were whatever the crews could find. One of the most common forms of improvised armor was sandbags. Crews would pile dozens of sandbags on the front and sides of their tanks. The theory was that the soft sand would help to detonate an incoming shell before it hit the main armor, or at least absorb some of its energy. The effectiveness of this was highly debated. Some studies later showed that the sandbags actually did very little to stop a high-velocity, armor-piercing round. But for the crew inside, it was a psychological comfort. It felt like they were doing something to improve their odds. Another common addition was spare track links. Crews would weld or hang spare sections of their tank's tracks onto the hull, particularly on the front glacis plate and the turret. This was essentially adding another layer of hardened steel. Unlike sandbags, extra track links could be quite effective, especially against shaped charge weapons like the German Panzerfaust, as they could disrupt the jet of molten metal. German tank crews were famous for this, often covering their Panther and Tiger tanks with a mosaic of spare tracks. They believed it gave them a critical edge. American crews on their Sherman tanks did the same, often creating elaborate racks to hold the heavy track sections. Perhaps the most rustic form of improvised armor was wood. In the Pacific Theater, U.S. Marine tankers would sometimes bolt thick wooden planks to the sides of their Shermans. The idea was that the wood would help defeat Japanese magnetic mines. On the Eastern Front, Soviet T-34 crews were known to weld mesh screens to their tanks to create a form of spaced armor, designed to detonate hollow charge warheads prematurely. Some crews even welded concrete onto their tanks. The most famous example of this was a U.S. Army M4 Sherman, commanded by Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Wardaddy Poole, who encased his tank in extra armor plates salvaged from wrecked vehicles. This practice of up-armoring in the field was often frowned upon by the high command. The extra weight of the sandbags, logs, and steel plates put a tremendous strain on the tank's engine and suspension, leading to more frequent mechanical breakdowns. There were even orders issued forbidding the practice, but the crews, who were the ones facing the enemy guns, largely ignored them. For them, a potential breakdown tomorrow was a better risk than a fatal penetration today. This was a classic conflict between the regulations of the rear echelon and the life-or-death realities of the front line. The improvised armor was a visual statement by the crews, a way of customizing their vehicle and taking control of their own survival. What don't we know about the science and psychology of improvised armor? Were there rigorous in the field tests conducted by any army to determine which materials actually worked best, or was it all based on rumor and superstition? How did the enemy react? Did they specifically target the parts of a tank that were not covered in extra armor? And can we ever truly measure the psychological benefit to the crews and whether that confidence translated into better combat performance regardless of the material's actual protective qualities? Number 11, how do you fight an enemy you can't get to? In many theaters of WWII, the fighting was not in open fields but in fortified positions. Bunkers, pillboxes, and machine gun nests made of concrete and steel were incredibly difficult to destroy with conventional weapons. Artillery could pound them for hours, but a well-built bunker could often survive. An infantryman trying to get close with a grenade or a satchel charge was likely to be cut down by machine gun fire. Tanks could fire at them with their main guns, but often the shells would just bounce off the thick concrete. A new kind of weapon was needed, something that could deliver a massive explosive charge right up to the bunker's firing slit. The answer was the flamethrower, but a soldier carrying a backpack flamethrower was horribly vulnerable. The logical next step was to put the flamethrower on a tank. While several armies developed official flamethrower tanks, some of the most effective and widely used versions were initially field modifications. U.S. forces, particularly in the Pacific, became pioneers in this. The Japanese defenders on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa had created a vast and complex network of caves, tunnels, and bunkers. Rooting them out was a slow, bloody, and costly business. The Marines and Army soldiers needed a way to project fire directly into these positions. They began to experiment with mounting flamethrowers on M4 Sherman tanks. These early versions were often improvised. The standard infantry flamethrower was mounted to fire out of the bow machine gunner's port. The fuel tanks for the flamethrower were carried inside the tank, which was incredibly dangerous for the crew. If the tank was hit, the flammable fuel could turn the inside into an inferno. But the weapon was so effective that the risk was deemed necessary. These tanks were nicknamed Zippos or Ronsons, after the popular cigarette lighters. They could shoot a jet of jellied gasoline or napalm over 100 yards. The psychological effect on the enemy was devastating. Even if the fire didn't kill them, it would consume the oxygen in a bunker, forcing the occupants to surrender or suffocate. The British also developed their own famous flamethrower tank, the Churchill Crocodile. While this was a more official design, its development was driven by the same battlefield necessity. The Crocodile was unique in that it towed its fuel supply in a separate armored trailer. This made it much safer for the crew inside the tank. The flamethrower nozzle was mounted in the front of the hull, replacing the machine gun. It could shoot a tongue of fire that was terrifying in its power and range. It was used with great effect in the fighting in Normandy and across Europe. These Dragon tanks changed the nature of infantry assaults on fixed positions. Instead of a costly direct attack, the infantry could now call up a Zippo or a Crocodile. The flamethrower tank would approach the bunker, douse it with liquid fire, and the infantry could then move in to clean up any remaining resistance. It was a brutal, terrifying weapon, but in the cold calculus of war, it saved the lives of countless infantrymen who would have otherwise died in frontal assaults. The flamethrower tank was a solution to a very specific tactical problem: how to defeat a dug-in enemy. It was an invention that combined the protection of a tank with one of the most primal and feared weapons of all: fire. What are the untold stories of the flamethrower tanks? Were there catastrophic accidents with the early improvised American models that were never officially documented? How did the crews of these tanks cope with the psychological burden of using such a horrific weapon? And did the enemy develop any specific tactics or weapons, like targeted artillery strikes on the fuel trailer of a crocodile to counter this threat? Number 10, can a bomb be smart without electronics? One of the greatest challenges for air forces in WWII was precision bombing. Hitting a small specific target like a bridge, a railway line, or a dam from thousands of feet in the air was incredibly difficult. Most bombs were dumb bombs. They were simply dropped from a plane and fell according to the laws of gravity. Bombing was an area effect weapon. You dropped hundreds of bombs in the hope that a few would hit the target. But what if you needed to hit a single vital point? What if you needed to destroy a dam to flood an industrial valley, but the dam was a massive reinforced structure? This was the problem facing the British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command in 1943. They wanted to destroy the great dams of Germany's Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of the enemy. The solution came from one of the great inventive minds of the war, Barnes Wallis. He was an aircraft designer, not a munitions expert. He approached the problem from a completely different angle. He knew that a normal bomb dropped on the dam would likely just explode on the surface or be absorbed by the vast mass of concrete. The only way to breach the dam was to place a massive explosive charge against the inner wall, below the water line, where the water pressure would amplify the force of the blast. But how do you get a bomb to do that? You can't drop it directly next to the wall because of defensive torpedo nets. Wallace's ingenious solution was the upkeep bouncing bomb. It was not a bomb in the traditional sense. It was a large, cylindrical mine about the size of an oil drum. The key to its success was that it had to be spun backwards at 500 revolutions per minute before it was dropped. When it was released from the specially modified Lancaster bomber at a very precise height, 60 feet in speed, the backspin would cause it to skip across the surface of the water, just like a skipping stone. It would bounce over the torpedo nets, and when it hit the dam wall, its remaining forward momentum would cause it to run down the wall before exploding at a predetermined depth, thanks to a hydrostatic fuse. It was a brilliant piece of physics and engineering. The mission to deliver these strange new weapons, Operation Chastis, was undertaken by the specially formed 617 Squadron, who would forever be known as the Dambusters. The raid on the night of May 16 to 17, 1943, was incredibly daring and dangerous. The pilots had to fly their huge 4-engine bombers at treetop level to avoid radar, and then make their final bombing run over the lake at a precise 60 feet. They used 2 spotlights, one under the nose and one under the belly of the plane, which were angled so that their beams would converge on the surface of the water when the plane was at the correct height to require a simple, brilliant, and non-electronic solution to a critical problem. The raid was a partial success. 2 of the 3 targeted dams were breached, causing significant flooding and disruption to German war production. The cost was high. 8 of the 19 aircraft that took off did not return. The bouncing bomb was a highly specialized, almost bizarre invention designed for a single purpose. It wasn't built by soldiers in a muddy field, but it embodies the same spirit of improvisation and out-of-the-box thinking. It was a mechanical, smart bomb in an age before computers and guidance systems. It solved an unsolvable problem by refusing to follow the conventional rules of how a bomb should behave. It was a testament to the power of a single brilliant idea to change the course of a campaign. What mysteries still surround the Dambusters raid and its unique weapon? How many failed prototypes and dangerous test flights were conducted before Wallace perfected the design of the upkeep bomb? Were there other, even more eccentric weapon ideas that Wallace proposed that were deemed too radical to even attempt? And what was the full long-term impact of the raid on German war production, a subject that historians still debate today? Number 9, what if your most important tool is a bed sheet? The war on the Eastern Front, especially in winter, was a struggle against the elements as much as against the enemy. The vast snow-covered plains of Russia and Ukraine provided almost no natural cover. A soldier in a dark uniform moving across a white landscape was a perfect target for a sniper. Camouflage was not a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. While armies did issue specialized winter camouflage, like white parkas and helmet covers, the supply was often insufficient, especially for the massive Soviet Red Army. And even when issued, this equipment would wear out, get lost, or be destroyed, so soldiers had to improvise their own winter camouflage. The most common material was whatever white cloth they could find. They would take bed sheets, tablecloths, or even women's clothing from abandoned houses and villages. They would cut them up to make simple smocks to wear over their dark greatcoats. They would wrap strips of white cloth around their rifles to break up their distinctive shape. They would fashion simple white hoods or helmet covers. This was not a sophisticated system. The camouflage was often dirty, ill-fitting, and offered little in the way of insulation. But it was far better than nothing. It helped a soldier to blend into the snowy background, to disappear. This practice was particularly vital for snipers and reconnaissance patrols, whose job depended on stealth. A Soviet sniper, hidden in a snowdrift, wrapped in a white sheet with only his rifle and his face visible, was a deadly and almost invisible threat. German soldiers did the same. There are countless photographs from the Eastern Front showing soldiers from both sides wearing these makeshift white coverings. It became a ubiquitous feature of winter warfare. The improvisation went beyond just clothing. They would use whitewash or white paint to camouflage their vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces. When paint was not available, they would pack snow onto the vehicles to help them blend in. They would dig their trenches and foxholes carefully, piling the dark earth they excavated onto a sled and dragging it away, so as not to leave a dark scar on the white landscape. They learned to move differently in the snow, to use the shadows and the contours of the land. Winter warfare was a specialized skill, and improvised camouflage was one of its most fundamental techniques. This story is not about a single invention, but about a collective, widespread adaptation to a harsh environment. It was about using the most basic materials to solve the most basic tactical problem, how not to be seen. It shows that sometimes the most effective tool a soldier has is not his weapon, but his ability to understand his environment and use it to his advantage. A simple bedsheet in the right hands could be as valuable as a rifle. It was a low-tech solution to a high-stakes problem. What do we not know about the practice of improvised winter camouflage? Were there written rules or specific techniques passed from soldier to soldier for creating the most effective camouflage from scavenged materials? How did commanders on a local level organize the procurement of these civilian materials? And are there any documented cases where a major tactical success was attributed directly to the superior improvised camouflage of a particular unit? Number 8. How do you clear a path through hell? For the infantryman, one of the most feared obstacles on the battlefield was the minefield, but a close second was the barbed wire entanglement. A thick belt of barbed wire could stop an infantry assault cold, holding the soldiers in the open where they could be cut down by machine gun and mortar fire. Getting through the wire was a deadly business. Engineers could try to cut it by hand with wire cutters, but this was slow and exposed them to enemy fire. They could use explosives like a Bangalore torpedo, a long pipe filled with explosives to blow a gap in it. But this was also dangerous and signaled the exact point of the attack. What was needed was a way to breach the wire quickly and create a wide enough path for many soldiers to get through. The solution was the grappling hook and rope. This was an idea so simple and ancient it seems almost out of place in a modern mechanized war. But it was incredibly effective. Soldiers in the field, often at the company or platoon level, would fabricate their own grappling hooks. They would take steel bars or rebar, heat them in a forge, and bend them into a 3 or 4 pronged hook. Sometimes they would weld pieces of metal together. The designs varied from unit to unit, each a unique creation of the local workshop. To this hook, they would attach a long, strong rope. The technique for using it was straightforward. During an assault, a soldier would throw the grappling hook out into the middle of the barbed wire entanglement. Then he and several other soldiers, taking cover in a shell crater or behind a rise in the ground, would pull on the rope with all their strength. The hook would snag on the wire. As they pulled, it would rip a whole section of the wire entanglement out of the ground, posts and all. By doing this several times, they could quickly clear a path several yards wide. It was a much faster and safer method than sending a single man out to cut the wire by hand. This technique was used by all armies. It was a standard part of assault engineer training, but the hooks themselves were often improvised. The official issue grappling hooks might not be available, or they might not be strong enough for the dense wire obstacles they encountered. So the soldiers made their own, bigger and stronger versions. In some cases, they would even attach the rope to the back of a tank. The tank would throw the hook and then use its powerful engine to drag a huge section of the wire clear, creating an instant breach for the infantry to pour through. This was a classic example of tank infantry cooperation. The grappling hook is a reminder that not all battlefield problems require a high-tech solution. Sometimes the answer is just brute force applied in a clever way. It was a tool that empowered a small group of soldiers to overcome a major obstacle. It was a piece of medieval technology that proved its worth in the middle of a 20th century war. It was simple, reliable, and it worked. One of the lesser-known details of this simple breaching technique were certain units or individuals renowned for their skill in fabricating and using these improvised grappling hooks. Did the enemy develop any countermeasures like specially anchored wire or booby traps designed to be triggered by a grappling hook? And are there any accounts of grappling hooks being used for other, more unusual purposes on the battlefield, such as pulling wounded comrades to safety or retrieving equipment from dangerous areas? Number 7. Can a tin can save your life from a tank? By the middle of the war, the tank had become a dominant force on the battlefield. For an ordinary infantryman, the sight of an enemy tank approaching was one of the most terrifying experiences imaginable. His rifle was useless against it. His machine gun was useless. He felt helpless. Armies rushed to develop specialized anti-tank weapons for the infantry, like the American bazooka, the British Piat, and the German Panzerfaust. But these were not always available in sufficient numbers, and sometimes even they were not enough. In the, desperate close quarters fighting of, places like Stalingrad, soldiers needed a simple, cheap, and, readily available anti-tank weapon. They found it in the form of the Molotov cocktail. The Molotov cocktail is not a single invention, but a generic term for an improvised incendiary weapon. Its modern form was first used extensively by the Finnish army against Soviet tanks during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. The Finns named it after the Soviet foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov as a form of sarcastic insult. The weapon itself is brutally simple, a glass bottle filled with a flammable liquid, usually gasoline or alcohol, with a fuel-soaked rag stuffed in the neck to act as a fuse. A soldier would light the rag and throw the bottle at the target. When the bottle shattered, the fuel would splash over the target and be ignited by the flaming rag. The Molotov cocktail was not powerful enough to penetrate the thick frontal armor of a tank, but it didn't have to. The key was to hit the tank in a vulnerable spot. A soldier would try to throw it onto the rear engine deck of the tank. The burning gasoline would seep through the engine ventilation grills and could set the engine on fire or ignite fuel or ammunition stored inside. This would force the crew to abandon the tank or destroy it completely. Even if it didn't destroy the tank, a bottle that burst on the front could splash burning fuel over the vision slits, blinding the crew and forcing them to button up or retreat. It was also a terrifying psychological weapon against the tank crew. The Molotov cocktail became the quintessential weapon of partisans, resistance fighters, and desperate soldiers everywhere. It was the great equalizer. Anyone could make one. The materials were everywhere. In Britain, during the dark days of 1940, when a German invasion seemed imminent, the Home Guard was trained in how to make and use Molotov cocktails. They were officially called 76 grenades or SIP grenades, self-igniting phosphorus, but everyone knew what they were. The Soviets, facing the massive German armored invasion in 1941, produced Molotov cocktails in factories and issued them as a standard anti-tank weapon. They developed more sophisticated versions with chemical mixtures that would ignite on contact, eliminating the need to light a rag. The Molotov cocktail is the ultimate symbol of battlefield improvisation. It is a weapon born of pure desperation. It required incredible courage to use. A soldier had to wait until a 40-ton steel monster was almost on top of him before he could stand up and throw his fragile glass bottle. It was a David and Goliath weapon. It turned a piece of trash into something that could kill a tank. What do we still not know about the use of this iconic weapon? How many tanks were actually destroyed or disabled by Molotov cocktails during the war? A number that is almost impossible to calculate accurately. What were some of the more unusual or dangerous recipes for the flammable liquid that soldiers developed through trial and error? And were there specific tactical doctrines developed by tank crews on how to defend against infantry armed with Molotovs, such as having an infantryman ride on the back of the tank to act as a lookout? Number 6. How do you turn a plane into a boat? The war in the Pacific was a war of vast distances over water. For pilots of carrier-based aircraft or long-range bombers, the ocean was a constant presence and a constant danger. If their plane was damaged or ran out of fuel, they would have to ditch in the sea. Surviving the crash was only the first challenge. The next was surviving in the water until they could be rescued. Every air crewman was issued a life vest, but for a whole crew trying to stay together or for a wounded man, a life vest was not enough. They needed a life raft. The standard issue life rafts were often small, difficult to deploy, and could be easily damaged. And sometimes, in a chaotic crash, they simply couldn't be reached. This is where one of the most unusual and ingenious pieces of survival equipment came into play: the aircraft's own empty fuel tanks. Many long-range aircraft like the P-38 Lightning Fighter or the B-17 Flying Fortress Bomber were equipped with external drop tanks. These were streamlined fuel tanks, usually made of aluminum, that were attached under the wings or fuselage to extend the plane's range. Once the fuel inside them was used up, the pilot could jettison them to reduce weight and drag. They were designed to be thrown away. But some resourceful airmen realized that these empty, hollow tanks were incredibly buoyant. They could be used as an improvised flotation device or even a makeshift canoe. There are numerous documented accounts of downed air crews using their drop tanks to survive. A fighter pilot who had to bail out over the ocean might find his own jettisoned drop tanks floating nearby. He could cling to them, which was much better than just treading water. A bomber crew that had to ditch their plane could, if they had time, try to release the drop tanks before impact in the hope they would survive the crash and be usable as rafts. The most famous story involves a P-38 pilot who not only used his drop tanks to stay afloat, but turned one into a small boat. After ditching his plane, he managed to climb onto one of his 150-gallon drop tanks. Using a small knife from his survival kit, he cut a hole in the top to create a makeshift cockpit. He was able to sit in the tank, partially shielded from the elements. He even fashioned a small sail from his parachute and tried to sail towards land. While he was eventually rescued, his ingenuity showed the incredible potential of these discarded pieces of equipment. This was not a planned or official use for a drop tank. It was a spontaneous act of survival thinking, where it was about looking at a piece of equipment and seeing not what it was designed for, but what it could become. It was about turning a piece of trash, something meant to be thrown away, into the single most important tool for staying alive. It's a powerful example of how, in a desperate situation, the human mind can find a new purpose for the most ordinary objects. What are the untold stories of this survival technique? How many air crews actually owed their survival to a floating drop tank, and how many of these stories were never officially recorded? Were there any attempts by aircraft manufacturers or military engineers to modify the design of drop tanks to make them more useful as emergency flotation devices, perhaps by adding handholds or storage compartments? And did any airman ever successfully use a drop tank canoe to sail all the way back to a friendly shore? Number 5. How do you aim a gun at the sky with nothing but string? Anti-aircraft gunnery is a complex science. You are not shooting at the target, you are shooting at where the target is going to be. It requires calculating the speed, direction, and altitude of the aircraft and then leading it by the correct amount. Dedicated anti-aircraft guns had sophisticated sights and predictors to help with this. But in the chaos of the battlefield, infantry units were often targeted by low-flying aircraft and had only their standard machine guns to defend themselves. Trying to hit a fast-moving plane with a machine gun using its normal sights was nearly impossible. The soldiers on the ground were dangerously exposed. The solution they came up with was the spider web sight, a brilliantly simple, field-made device for improving anti-aircraft gunnery. It was not a single, standardized invention, but a concept that was adapted and built by soldiers in countless different ways. The basic idea was to create a new, larger sight that would help the gunner to judge the correct lead for an aircraft. They would take a piece of wire, often from a tin can or a fence, and bend it into a circle. They would then attach this wire circle to a mount that could be fixed to the barrel or receiver of the machine gun. Across this circle, They would stretch threads or thin wires to create a pattern like a spider's web or a series of concentric circles. This simple device gave the gunner a visual reference. He would look through his normal rear sight and then through the spiderweb sight at the front. The lines on the web would help him to judge the speed of the target aircraft as it moved across the sight. An experienced gunner would learn to lead the plane by a certain number of rings, depending on its speed and angle. It was not a perfect system, it was a rough and ready tool for estimation. But it was a massive improvement over having no specialized sight at all. It gave the gunner a fighting chance. These sights were made from whatever materials were on hand. The ring could be wire, a metal washer, or even a piece of carved wood. The web could be made from thread from a sewing kit, wire from a communications cable, or even human hair. Each sight was a unique handcrafted object. It was a piece of folk art created for a deadly purpose. The British Home Guard, preparing for a possible invasion, were taught how to make similar sights for their Lewis and Browning machine guns. American troops in the Pacific used them to defend against low-level attacks. The spiderweb sight is a perfect example of how soldiers can use basic geometric principles to solve a complex technical problem. It didn't require any advanced technology or manufacturing, it just required a bit of wire, some thread, and a good understanding of the problem. It was a democratic invention, one that could be made by any soldier with a little bit of time and ingenuity. It empowered the ordinary infantryman to fight back effectively against a threat from the sky. What do we not know about the origins and use of these improvised sights? Was there a single original spiderweb sight that inspired all the others, or did the idea arise independently in many different places at once? How did gunners train themselves to use these non-standard sights effectively? And are there any combat reports that specifically credit the use of an improvised anti-aircraft sight with the successful downing of an enemy plane? Number 4, can you build a bridge out of a toy? Getting an army across a river is one of the oldest and most difficult challenges in warfare. If the bridges have been destroyed, you have to build a new one. This is a job for combat engineers, and it's a slow, dangerous process done under the threat of enemy fire. During WWII, armies developed sophisticated pontoon bridges and prefabricated steel bridges, like the famous Bailey Bridge. The Bailey Bridge was a marvel of military engineering, a kind of giant, pre-made metal Lego set that could be assembled quickly to span a river. It was one of the most important inventions of the war, but it had one limitation: it was designed to be built on top of pontoons or on prepared foundations. What if the riverbanks were too high or too muddy to support a normal bridge? This was the problem faced by the British Army in Italy in 1943. They needed a way to get their tanks and trucks across rivers and ravines quickly. The solution came from a surprising place of toy. And a British officer named Donald Bailey, the same man who invented the Bailey Bridge, was a fan of engineering toys. He had a model building set, and he used it to design a new kind of bridge. He came up with the idea of a Bailey suspension bridge. But the most ingenious part of the system was a smaller, lighter bridge that was used to get the main bridge building components across the gap in the first place. This was the scissors bridge. The concept was adapted and put onto a tank. The Churchill Avray Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers was a modified Churchill tank designed to carry specialized engineering equipment. One of its most impressive tools was the small box girder SBG bridge. This was a 30-foot long bridge, strong enough to support a tank, that was carried on the front of the Avray. When the tank reached a gap, like a collapsed smaller bridge or a wide anti-tank ditch, it would use a hydraulic system to lay the bridge across the gap in a matter of minutes. But for wider gaps, a more radical solution was needed. This led to the development of the scissors bridge, mounted on a tank chassis. The scissors bridge was a bridge that was folded in half, like a pair of scissors. It was carried on top of a modified tank. When the tank reached the river or ravine, a powerful hydraulic arm would lift the folded bridge up and then unfold it, extending it across the gap. The whole process took only a few minutes. Once the bridge was in place, the tank carrying it would detach itself, and other vehicles could immediately begin to cross. It was a stunning piece of mobile engineering. It allowed an armored column to cross an obstacle without having to stop and wait for hours or days for engineers to build a traditional bridge. The scissors bridge and other mobile bridging solutions like it were part of the family of vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies, developed for the D-Day landings. They were a testament to the idea that a tank could be more than just a gun platform. It could be a tool. It could be a bridge layer, a minesweeper, or a bunker buster. These inventions were the result of a systematic approach to problem solving, but one that was inspired by the kind of creative, out-of-the-box thinking you might find in a toy box. It was a way of looking at a military problem with the eyes of a playful engineer. What are the lesser-known engineering challenges of the mobile bridges? How many times did the complex hydraulic systems fail under combat conditions, leaving the bridge and its crew stranded and vulnerable? Were there any competing designs for mobile bridges that were tested but ultimately rejected? And how did enemy forces adapt their tactics to try and counter this ability of Allied armored columns to cross obstacles so quickly? Number 3, how can a soldier carry more anger? In the ferocious, close-quarters fighting of island hopping in the Pacific, or clearing out villages in Europe, the hand grenade was a vital weapon. It was the infantryman's personal artillery. It could be thrown into a machine gun nest, a bunker, or the window of a house to clear it of enemy soldiers. A single soldier often needed to carry a lot of them. The standard American infantry web gear had pouches for carrying ammunition, a first aid kit, and a canteen, but it wasn't really designed to carry a large number of grenades. A soldier could stuff a couple into his pockets or hang them from his belt. But this was clumsy and insecure. The grenades could fall off or get snagged on things, especially when crawling or moving through thick brush. The problem was simple: how to carry more grenades securely and accessibly. The solution was the grenade vest, an improvised piece of equipment made by the soldiers themselves. The idea was to take a standard issue vest, like the M1936 cotton field vest, or even just a jacket, and sew a series of pockets onto the front. Each pocket was perfectly sized to hold a single Mk2 pineapple grenade. A soldier wearing one of these vests could comfortably and securely carry a dozen or more grenades, leaving his hands free for his rifle. The pockets were usually open at the top, allowing for quick access. He could simply reach down, pull out a grenade, pull the pin, and throw it. This was a common field modification, particularly among assault troops and paratroopers, the soldiers who were most likely to be involved in close quarters fighting. The vests were often made by the company tailor or by the soldiers themselves if they had access to a needle and thread. The design was not standardized. Some vests had 2 rows of pockets, some had 3. Some were made from canvas, some from repurposed sandbags. Each one was a custom job, tailored to the needs and preferences of the soldier who would wear it. The grenade vest was a simple but highly effective innovation. It allowed a soldier to carry a much greater combat load of a crucial weapon. It was a force multiplier. A squad of soldiers equipped with these vests could lay down a terrifying barrage of explosives during the final moments of an assault. It was also a psychological statement. A soldier wearing a vest covered in grenades looked intimidating. It was a clear sign that he was part of the point of the spear, the man whose job it was to close with and destroy the enemy. This is another example of a low-tech invention that had a big impact. It wasn't a new weapon, but a better way of carrying an old one. It grew out of a direct practical need felt by the soldiers on the front line. They saw a shortcoming in their standard equipment and they fixed it themselves, using the materials they had on hand. It was a small but significant improvement in the lethality of the individual infantryman. What do we not know about the history of the improvised grenade vest? Did the idea originate with a specific unit? And if so, how did it spread to other units and other theaters of the war? Were there any official attempts to design and mass-produce a standardized grenade vest based on these field-made examples? And are there any accounts from soldiers describing how their custom-made vest gave them a specific advantage in a particular firefight? Number 2, how do you how to ship the size of a skyscraper? In the early years of the war in the Atlantic, German U-boats were wreaking havoc on Allied shipping. They were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening to starve Britain into submission. One of the keys to the U-boat's success was their ability to attack at night. A U-boat running on the surface was a very small target, low in the water, and difficult to see in the dark. A large merchant ship, or its escorting warship, on the other hand, was a dark shape silhouetted against the slightly less dark night sky. This made them easy targets for a U-boat commander looking through his periscope. The Allies needed to find a way to make their ships invisible at night. The solution came from a Canadian professor of zoology named Donald MacIver. He had studied animal camouflage, specifically the way that some animals use a principle called counter-illumination to hide from predators. The idea is that an animal, like a fish or a squid, will have a dark back to blend in with the deep water below and a light belly. Some species can even generate their own light on their undersides to perfectly match the brightness of the sky above, making them invisible to a predator looking up from below. And MacIver wondered if this same principle could be applied to a ship. What if you could make a ship's dark silhouette as bright as the night sky behind it? It would, in theory, disappear. This led to the development of a top-secret project called diffused lighting camouflage. The idea was to mount a series of low-intensity electric lights along the sides of a ship, on the superstructure, and on the masts. The lights would be pointed outwards and slightly downwards. The brightness of these lights would be carefully controlled by a photoelectric cell. The cell would measure the brightness of the night sky and then automatically adjust the ship's lights to match it. From a distance, especially from the low viewing angle of a U-boat's periscope, the ship would no longer be a dark silhouette. It would blend in with the sky. The system was first tested on a Canadian corvette, Schmick's Cobalt, in 1941. The initial sea trials were astonishingly successful. In test after test, observers on a submarine found that a ship equipped with the diffused lighting system was incredibly difficult to see. It could approach much closer before it was detected. The system reduced the visibility of a ship by up to 70%. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy also began experimenting with the technology, fitting it to a number of their warships and merchant vessels. Diffused lighting camouflage was a brilliant, counterintuitive idea. The normal instinct is to make a ship as dark as possible at night. This system did the opposite. It added light to achieve invisibility. It was a high-tech solution involving photocells and complex wiring, but it was born from an observation of the natural world. It was a case of military technology learning a trick from a squid. While the invention of radar eventually became a more effective tool for combating the U-boat threat, for a time, this strange and ingenious system of hiding with light played a small but important role in the Battle of the Atlantic. What are the remaining secrets of this classified project? How many ships were actually fitted with the system, and are there any documented U-boat attack reports where the submarine commander specifically noted his inability to see a target that was later identified as having diffused lighting? Were there any significant technical problems with the system, such as the lights being too bright or not reliable enough in the harsh North Atlantic weather? And why did the technology seem to fade into obscurity after the war, despite its proven effectiveness? Number 1. Can a single shotgun changed the rules of war? The war in the Pacific was uniquely brutal. It was often fought at extremely close ranges in dense, claustrophobic jungles. The standard issue M1 Garand rifle was a fine weapon for open country, but it was long, unwieldy, and slow to fire in a sudden, close-quarters ambush. What the soldiers and Marines needed was a weapon that could deliver overwhelming, devastating firepower at bad breath range. They needed a shotgun. The American military had used shotguns in previous conflicts, and the Winchester Model 1897 trench gun was issued in limited numbers during WWII. It was a formidable weapon, but soldiers, as always, wanted to make it even better. The field modification they performed was simple and ruthless. They sawed off the barrel. A standard shotgun has a long barrel to ensure a tight pattern of shot at a distance. But in the jungle, long-distance shots were rare. The fighting was close and fast. By cutting the barrel down to just over the legal minimum length, or sometimes even shorter, a soldier could create a weapon that was much lighter, more compact, and easier to handle in thick undergrowth. It was also psychologically terrifying. A sawed-off shotgun, known as a whippet gun or scattergun, made a deafening roar and fired a wider pattern of buckshot at close range. It was the ultimate room broomer, capable of clearing a trench or a bunker with a single blast. This was not an official modification. It was done in the field by individual soldiers or unit armorers. It was technically a violation of regulations and possibly the laws of war, but in the kill-or-be-killed environment of the Pacific Islands, such concerns were often secondary. A sawed-off shotgun was seen as a vital tool for survival. There are numerous first-hand accounts from veterans who tell of acquiring a shotgun and then immediately having it modified to make it more suitable for jungle fighting. The use of the shotgun in this way was a source of controversy. The German government had protested the American use of shotguns in World War I, claiming they caused unnecessary suffering and violated the Hague Convention. But the American military had rejected the protest, arguing that the shotgun was a legitimate weapon of war. In WWII, the practice of modifying them continued, driven by the demands of the soldiers who used them. It was a bottom-up innovation, a direct response to the unique tactical challenges of a specific environment. The sawed-off shotgun is a powerful symbol of the brutal realities of close-quarters combat. It represents a deliberate choice to trade range and precision for raw, overwhelming, close-range power. It was an adaptation of an existing weapon to make it more lethal in a specific context. It was not a clever gadget or complex machine. It was a simple, brutal modification that turned a hunting weapon into one of the most feared close combat tools of the war. It's a reminder that sometimes the most ingenious invention is not about creating something new, but about perfecting the ability to destroy. What don't we know about the prevalence of this practice? How widespread was the use of sawed-off shotguns, and in which units was it most common? Were there any soldiers ever officially disciplined for making this illegal modification to their weapon? And what was the real measurable impact of these weapons on the tactics of jungle warfare? Did they truly provide a decisive edge in close quarters combat, or is their fearsome reputation more a product of military legend?